Good morning, everybody, and thanks for watching. So, we left off in Galatians chapter 2, where the Apostle Paul withstood Peter, the chief of the apostles, to his face because of his behavior towards Paul's evangel when Peter came down to Galatia. You see, when Peter came down to visit the Galatians, he was eating with them, was living as them, everything was fine. And then when those of James came, those from the circumcision came down, that's when Peter shrank back like a 14-year-old schoolgirl who's sitting at the lunch table with all her lifelong friends and then gets up and leaves them behind immediately once the mean girls or the popular girls come in. So Peter, who was sitting there, was fine with the Galatians. Once those of the law, once those of James came, once those of the circumcision came, he shrank back and went with them. And that group also stole Barnabas and other believers there because of their influence. And Paul said, remember, he said to Peter, stood up and said this to his face, that you are not correct in your attitude toward the evangel. Now, keep this in mind. Peter was Jesus' right-hand man. And in a few verses before this, in Galatians 2, 7, 8, and 9, Paul says that Peter is entrusted with the gospel of the circumcision. He's numero uno. He's in charge of the gospel of the circumcision. He was Jesus' right-hand man when Jesus walked on this earth. So he knew his message. This is not talking about a poor attitude to the evangel, which is just one message, which many people want to say, because Peter was an expert in the circumcision gospel. He wouldn't have a poor attitude towards that. What did he have a poor attitude towards was Paul's message, which was a different message. Why did he have that poor attitude? Why did those of James have that poor attitude? Because of law. Because of the law they were trying to inject into Paul's message. That's it. That's the issue. And remember, this issue that Paul had was not with the Pharisees. It was not with the Sadducees. It was not with the scribes. It was not with unreligious Jewish people or unreligious people of the nations. The issue Paul was having and the disagreement was with respect to the evangel towards Peter, towards James, towards John. The conflict is between believers in Jesus Christ, those who walked with Jesus when he was here on the earth, and Paul. And their disagreement is because of Paul's message is one of pure, unadulterated grace, and their message, Peter, James, and John, included law, and they were trying to inject law in Paul's message. That's the disagreement here. That's their attitude that was not correct towards the evangel. And now, in verse 15, Paul turns his attention to the Jews that were believing his message and explains where our righteousness comes from. So in verses 15 through 17 in chapter 2, here we go. We, Apostle Paul talking, who by nature are Jews and not sinners of the nations, having perceived that a man is not being justified by works of law, except alone through the faith of Jesus Christ. We also believe in Christ Jesus, that we may be justified by the faith of Christ, and not by works of law, seeing that by works of law shall no flesh at all be justified. So here's Paul's message. He's saying 2 times in those 3 scriptures that we are not justified by works of law. We are justified by the faith of Christ. And this is faith that comes from Christ. It's based on what Christ did. It's based on Christ believing God and God raising Christ from the dead. It's us tapping into that, what Jesus did, that justifies us. And that's apart from any work of law. Many people, as we know, want to say that you have to perform some commandment, perform some work of law in order to obtain this righteousness. But Paul is saying no. He is saying no, that there's no law you have to follow, not one thing you have to do with respect to the law, but we are justified through the faith that comes from Jesus. Jesus Christ's faith of going to the cross, of dying, and then trusting God to resurrect him. And when God did that, we are justified based on that act, based on the faith of Jesus and tapping into that faith, apart from any law. Well, then Christians say, okay, maybe, it's by faith, but you have to follow commandments, or you have to do certain things with respect to the law, perform good works along with that faith. Well, Paul is debarring that here. If you look at chapter 3, verses 1 through 4, Paul says, "O foolish Galatians, who bewitches you, before whose eyes Jesus Christ was graphically crucified? This only I want to learn from you. Did you get the Spirit by works of law, or by hearing of faith? So foolish are you. Undertaking in spirit, are you now being completed in flesh? So much did you suffer vainly, since surely it also is vainly." So what Paul's saying here is that we got this gift from Jesus Christ, not by the flesh. And when Paul's talking about flesh here, it's you working of your own to follow law. As he just said in verses 15 to 17, no flesh at all is justified by works of law. It's not our flesh trying to do works that justify us. It's the faith of Jesus Christ. And now that they received that gift, this is what the circumcisionists, Peter, James, and John, were coming in to do. They were trying to put them back under the law in order to complete their justification. Well, Paul says, you didn't get this by following the law. Why would you need to follow the law to keep it or to finish it? Jesus Christ finished it. Jesus Christ finished it when he had faith, when he went to the cross. Okay, if Jesus Christ didn't have faith and he didn't go to the cross, then yes, all is lost. But Jesus Christ had faith. He went to the cross. He was tortured. He was killed. He was dead. And he was resurrected from the dead. That completed it. That's why we walk in spirit, is what Paul's saying here. So if that act gave us our walk in spirit, justified us, apart from any law, as he clearly said in verses 15 to 17, then why would you go back to the law to keep something that the law didn't give you in the first place? And that's the whole disagreement here between Peter, James, and John and their misunderstanding of Paul's gospel. They misunderstood Paul's gospel because they're putting law into the walk. There is no law in our walk at all. No mention of following a commandment, following a work of law is part of Paul's gospel. And anyone who says that you have to follow certain laws, whatever law they're talking about, in order to prove you're saved or justified, in order to add to your justification, then you're in Peter, James, and John's camp trying to influence Paul's message, and your attitude is wrong towards the truth of the evangel. And you're doing exactly what the circumcisionists were doing in chapter 2. So if we go down here, Paul goes back to Abraham a little bit. I'm just going to read it. What do we got? 9. Okay, 5 to 9. This is chapter 3, verse 5 to 9. He then who is supplying you with the Spirit and operating works of power among you, did you get the Spirit by works of law or by hearing of faith? According as Abraham believes God, and it is reckoned to him for righteousness. Know consequently that those of faith, these are sons of Abraham. Now the scripture, perceiving that God is justifying the nations by faith, brings before an evangel to Abraham. And in you shall all the nations be blessed, so that those of faith are being blessed together with believing Abraham. So now Paul's going back to Abraham here a little bit. And Abraham got righteousness because he believed God. And those that participate and believe Abraham, they get the gifts that Abraham was going to get. So it says here, so that those of faith are being blessed together with believing Abraham. So if you believe Abraham, you get the gifts. You're being blessed together with him. Well, we can reword this kind of for what Paul said in chapter 2, verses 15 to 17. So that those of faith, these are my words, just kind of rewording what I think Paul is saying here. So that those of faith are being blessed together with believing Jesus. So it's Jesus that believed God, and he attained righteousness. It was Abraham who believed God, and he attained righteousness. So it's the act of Abraham that got righteousness, and then people participate in that with Abraham. It's Jesus who is righteous. It's Jesus who believed God and did what he did. And then it's us that partake in what Jesus did. So that those of faith are being blessed together with believing Jesus. It's the believing Jesus and what he did that gives us our righteousness. And we just step into it and participate with him. So if we're believing, if we've been given belief by God, it's not of our own, lest it be a work. It's given to us by God. We believe that Jesus is what he is and has done what he has done. And we participate. We step into what Jesus Christ did. Just like Abraham believed God and got righteousness, and people step into that and participate in it, all based on Abraham's act. In the same way, all based on Jesus' act, we step into that and have the same promises that he has because we participate with him based on what he did, not on what we do with respect to the works of the law. So, Paul goes on in Galatians 3. I don't think I'm going to have time to go over that, but I'm going to finish chapter 3 in the next video, and then probably one more video on Galatians, and then I'll move on. But just in summary here, the first 2 chapters or so, 2-3 chapters of Galatians, Paul is vehemently defending his evangel against law, and he's not defending it against the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, other Jewish people. He's defending it against those that walked with Jesus while Jesus was here on earth, because Jesus gave them a specific message, the circumcision message, that has to do with accepting Jesus as the Messiah and has elements of the law that must be followed. Granted, if you follow them, it's all of God anyway. He causes you to do or not do whatever he says you should or shouldn't do. So it's all of God. But Peter, James, and John had a specific message. And when it came into contact with Paul's message, there was a disagreement. There's misunderstanding. Misunderstanding on Peter, James, and John's and the circumcision's part. Because they were expert in their message. Of course they were. They walked with Jesus. They talked with Jesus. They had the message. They were entrusted with that message. But when they came and tried to inject elements of that message into Paul's evangel, that's when Paul said that you are not correct in your attitude towards the evangel. And then he goes on the defense as to why. The why is that law has nothing to do with Paul's message. It's a message of grace. It's a message based on the faith, death, entombment, and resurrection of Jesus Christ for our righteousness alone, apart from any works to get it, apart from any works to keep it or maintain it or prove that you somehow had it. It's a different message. It's a message of grace, and we must embrace that difference. Thank you.